I'm hosting today's webinar, which is on behalf of the Landscape Institute and the CIC. So I want to extend a really warm welcome to all of our speakers. We're incredibly lucky to have such experts in the room, and thank you to each of you for bringing your work and your perspectives to our discussion today. I should say the session is being recorded and will be shared afterwards to all of you together with resources. So, next slide, please. A moment just to introduce Workstream 8 and also the purpose of today's session. So the Construction Industry Council brings together experts on a volunteer basis from over 40 different organisations from right across the built and natural environment sectors. And our activity for 2025 has been to plan a climate and nature literacy CPD programme, which is freely available to all. So as you can see on the left, there are 10 different work streams covering a whole range of topics and each bringing together different skills, competencies and practice. And there's more about this on the CIC's website. Next slide, please. So, Workstream 8 is led by the Landscape Institute and focuses on adaptation and resilience. Both are critical actions in a changing climate and apply seamlessly right across built and natural environments. So our objectives are to help practitioners by sharing skills and creating connections across professional boundaries and partnerships. It's really about promoting more holistic and also innovative ways of working, and then through these creating impetus for change. So the group has been working on 3 key themes: biodiversity, water and heat, because each of these plays such a pivotal role in adaptation and also in building resilience. Next slide, please. So, today's webinar is focused on biodiversity. Next slide, please. So biodiversity loss across the world has created wide-ranging global changes, fragmentation, degraded ecosystems, and also disrupted climate patterns. And this result is really a fundamental disconnection with our natural systems as a whole. It's crucial to acknowledge the reality of this current baseline and also critical to bring a more holistic understanding of nature and climate to understand these issues and how to work together on these. So in planning the webinar today, we really wanted to focus on those bigger picture fundamentals. And also we wanted to focus on how do we approach all this with optimism, linking across places, projects, people and skills. Optimism is also critical to action. So today we're placing the focus on some fundamentals and bigger context matters. So globally accepted principles such as no loss and restore, gathering measurable data from the outset, key to knowing what we're actually restoring and creating and whether it is of value, and if it is, what value it is. And then that nature and its diversity, it is in fact very locally significant, but it also extends beyond sites and beyond regions and is also part of an important global dialogue, and that our actions are part of that community. So we have 4 inspirational speakers joining us from the UK and also from India, and they'll be sharing their work on international actions to nature positive and the importance of healthy ecosystems to society, on knowledge gathering and the really important role of heritage and community traditions in land stewardship, and also practical steps to restoration, testing different approaches, planting, timelines, and comparative benefits to connectivity, soils, and species. And then also reconnecting people with this process and the role of design as a means for bringing nature into people's experience. So during the slides, and the speakers, you're welcome, and we encourage you to share your questions and thoughts in our Q&A section. So add questions as we go through, and we'll have time after the presentations then to put your questions to the panel. So the Q&A function's open, and we're looking forward to having a really good discussion this morning. And please also do feel free to add likes and comments to questions as we go through. So I'm going to pass on to Ambika now to welcome our speakers. Next slide.
Thank you, Lucy. Our four speakers today bring together an extraordinary range of skills and insight. And first up, I'd like to introduce Dr. Chris Moss. Dr. Chris Moss is a principal consultant at Greengage Environmental, where he supports the definition and delivery of corporate nature strategies for a range of real estate corporates and financial institutions. Recently, Chris's work has centered around assessing nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, and is helping organizations to understand their embodied impacts on nature. Chris has a background in sociology, environmental planning, and management, and his PhD research focus on the integration of green infrastructure with community-led planning initiatives in England. Over to you, Chris.
Many thanks, Ambika, and many thanks, Lucy, for the intro. Yeah, today I'm going to be talking to you about what we mean by nature positive, both conceptually and practically. And I want to start with one of my favorite quotes by the naturalist and conservationist John Muir, who said that when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And it's this inherent complexity and interconnectedness that is true of mycorrhizal fungi networks, true of ecosystems in unto themselves, and is also true of the concept of nature positive. And through this, you'll see why. Next slide, please. So we'll start by understanding what nature is. We all think we know what we mean by it, but actually, when we think about it, often we approach it with kind of blinkered view. Nature is more than just biodiversity. It's more than just biodiversity net gain. It's more than what is within our site and project boundaries when we're undertaking works. It's more than a moral obligation, and it's more than the responsibility of ecologists, landscape architects, etc. alone. And we can think about it as these four realms of land, atmosphere, freshwater, ocean that underpin and support society. Next slide, please. So why do we need to consider nature now? Why do we need to consider nature more? Why do we need a framework for nature positivity? Well, at the root, it's because we need nature. We depend upon nature for basically everything. The World Economic Forum will tell you that 50% of global GDP is reliant upon healthy and functioning ecosystems. The reality of the situation is 100% of all productivity is reliant on our Earth. It's everything. It's our provider. We need it. We depend upon it. We rely upon it for a whole range of things, both for our health, for our businesses, for the functioning of our societies. But we're degrading it. We're degrading it at an unprecedented rate. And we need to readdress this imbalance. Next slide, please. We're going further, and many of you on the call today will be kind of working in the built environment, in the construction sector. We need to consider nature more seriously because our sector is one of the top 5 most exposed sectors to nature-related risks. These risks will be increasingly stress tested on our loan books. In higher interest rates will result from these risks. There'll be stricter lending requirements. There are knock-on implications for not considering nature in our operations and the provision for our business models. And all of these things have implications. And thinking about those risks present to both business and society, water scarcity is one of the key ones presented to us, and construction and the built environment and our practices are inherently water dependent. It's a very water intensive sector. Next slide, please. We also need to consider nature because regulations are changing. The landscape is shifting and there are more and more requirements as we appreciate that these risks are abundant and are currently not accounted for. Regulations are stepping in to ensure that organizations are considering them more effectively. So regulation is catching up and people are having to consider nature in more innovative and broader ways. Um, and because the construction sector is a key driver of risk. It's principally a driver of what's been coined planetary insolvency, and I really like this term because it thinks about and frames um, uh, something as the ability of the Earth to support us. The planetary solvency is the ability of the Earth to support us. If we think about a solvent pension, it continues to provide in perpetuity, and a solvent Earth does the same. So we need to reverse planetary insolvency or address it, and the built environment construction sector globally is a key solution sector to doing so. Um, Thinking about this planetary insolvency, well, we can see our path to insolvency here. These are our planetary boundaries from 2009 up to 2023, and we can see that we're increasingly exceeding our planetary boundaries. We're living beyond our means. Our production and consumption patterns aren't sustainable. They aren't circular enough. So we're driving this increasing insolvency, which is having a wide range of impacts for communities and ecosystems right around the world. Next slide, please. So the problem is that we're trying to make a circular peg fit a square hole. The circular peg is our natural capital or our nature, and the square hole is our financial economy. If we click again, we can see that it doesn't fit. We're trying to make a fundamental system, nature, speak to an arbitrary system that's been created without any consideration of the former, financial economy. So there's this language barrier, and thinking about nature positive, thinking about stocks and flows of natural capital can be our Rosetta Stone, really, to address this language barrier and this misinterpretation or misalignment. And with that, nature positive as a framing, as a concept, as a framework, could be our equivalent net zero pathway, but for nature. Next slide, please. So when we talk about nature positive, we're talking about this framework. We're talking about going from our current position of driving nature loss globally through actions even at a local scale to halting and reversing nature loss and ultimately obtaining nature recovery. And the work of the Nature Positive Initiative has set a few key milestones and objectives for zero loss from 2020 onwards. For nature positivity, so halting and reversing nature loss by 2030, and for full recovery by 2050. Yeah, next slide, please. And if we click again, please. Thank you. So when we think about this kind of contextually, and I think about it in a UK context specifically, we're beginning to chart this path, albeit kind of in a relatively siloed way. We're beginning to introduce things that address the need or acknowledge the need for no net loss or net gain, biodiversity net gain plus 10% on new non-exempt development introduced in February 2024, for example, and being rolled out. We've got the delivery of wider environmental net gains, and environmental net gain being referenced in our sort of 25-year environment plan, of having a broader net positive impact. So broadening out from just a focus on biodiversity, but to other elements of nature and ecosystems as well, from things like addressing flood management, temperature regulation, nutrient neutrality, balancing access and recreation with enhanced pressures on nature, and also thinking about the role of our local nature recovery strategies and having a strategic vision for nature recovery across England and the UK, and I believe Fiona will be touching on LRSs in a bit more detail later on. So we can think about how we're beginning in the UK to chart this path towards nature positivity, but all of this is very domestic, right? It's very focused. We're thinking about it on a project by project basis. We're thinking about it within our red line boundaries or within, say, a 2 or 5 or 10 kilometer buffer of where impacts are taking place. But how do we get towards full nature recovery, as is the ambition of getting towards nature positivity. Well, we do so by thinking about our embodied impacts on nature and thinking back to the quote at the beginning, our connectedness, how things are hitched to everything else. So next slide, please. So what can nature positive do? Well, it can provide a framework for internalizing the externality of nature. And by that, I mean embedding it within decision making, whatever decision making, both within the built environment sector and beyond, in a more meaningful way so that decisions can reflect the true social and environmental costs of our actions. It can provide a framework for encouraging the reduction of impact on nature, and it plots a trajectory to recovery with helpful time frames to work towards. But it's definitely much more of a process and an ambition than it is necessarily an end goal. Next slide, please. So when we're thinking about nature positivity, and I said this, we need to account for our embodied impacts. What I mean by that is we need to think about things that are happening beyond our red line boundary. Need to think about our embodied nature. And according to the UK these are impacts caused by resource extraction, manufacturing processes, transportation of raw materials. Anybody that works in life cycle assessment or has exposure to life cycle assessment will know this as stages A1 to A3. But these are the off-site impacts that occur as a result of our projects and the decisions that we make and the building of buildings and other infrastructures as well. Next slide, please. We can think of embodied nature as this nature beyond the red line. If we click a couple of times, please, we'll see the graphic come to life. This is acknowledging that our on-site impacts are the tip of the iceberg, and that actually the off-site impacts, our embodied nature impacts, are not only as yet unaccounted for, but are the vast majority of impacts that happen to ecosystems, to habitats, to communities around the world. Next slide, please. And when we think about them, we can think about embodied impacts as for nature as analogous with embodied impacts for carbon. We have means and ways of addressing embodied carbon and measuring it. And we can think about these two things in synergy, but there are key distinctions between them, be that nature is much more complex than carbon. We can get to a single unified, universally accepted metric of impact, kilogram CO2 equivalent with carbon, but we're not going to be able to get to the same all-encompassing metric for nature because it won't be suitable, because nature is inherently location-specific, context-dependent. Impacts are happening, magnitudes of hazards are different, the sensitivity of ecosystems to potential hazards are different. So we need to embrace the complexity associated with it. Next slide, please. But there are ways of being able to do that, and we can apply life cycle impact assessment methods and principles to account for embodied nature impacts. And I appreciate this is getting increasingly complex, but please do stay with me. We can think about our embodied impacts, and we can think about a method for addressing them as such that we can think about the inputs, the energy used, the raw materials used, the land we use, the water we use. We can convert these to a range of different midpoint impacts that are associated with land stress, water stress, eutrophication potential, etc. And we can use tools to come to an end output, an end impact, which is often expressed as the potentially disappeared fraction of species per year. Next slide, please. Appreciate that doesn't necessarily help add much clarity at this stage. So I've included a worked example. This is a project that we did for a public realm redevelopment scheme in London, and we used One-Click LCA's biodiversity supply chain stress tool to assess the embodied nature impact of the hardscaping of this public realm redevelopment. Next slide, please. The key outcome was that we identified the top 10 materials that were contributing to biodiversity loss. We can see there that steel planters, cable ducting, hot dip, pre-galvanized steel, drainage systems, etc., all contribute. And we can see the extent to which they did, that the embodied impact of the steel planters accounted for 52% of all of the impact associated with those upfront of those A1 to A3 impacts. You can see the measure is 436 potentially disappeared fraction of species per meter squared per year. That's if we're thinking that 100% of the species would be lost over a 436 36 meter squared area. But we could think about that as well as a 10% loss in species over a 4,360 meter squared area. We could think about it as a 1% loss over a 43,600 meter squared area, for example. These measures are not absolute. They're massively caveated and inherently limited, but they provide us with a means of being able to undertake comparative analyses of the relative impact of different materials, which, when we're thinking about projects and we're thinking about our role as influencing design, then they provide us with a means of being able to influence design to make less impactful choices. Next slide, please. We can think about how this relates to different stages in the design, and we can and go more broadly, so not just specific materials, but broad categories or where our impacts are occurring. Next slide, please. But these approaches are caveated. My hope is that you come away from today not with being an expert on LCA, but from understanding that nature positivity is broad, it's complex, but we can begin to consider it in quite specific contexts. We can begin to apply it in a range of contexts, both from public realm redevelopment schemes, from residential schemes and development schemes and construction projects, etc. And they can complement our other on-site and off-site impact assessments to make informed decisions about reducing our impact. Next slide. So I'll leave you with this graphic and a question of how we can begin to challenge business as usual as we chart our path towards nature positivity. To me, there is no nature positive without accountability for embodied impacts, thinking about where things come from, where they're being extracted, where they're being manufactured, where they're having impacts in far removed places way beyond our red line boundaries, but where they have far-reaching consequences, both socially, environmentally. And this isn't just about ecosystems, but this is about communities as well, both locally and globally, close to home, further afield, and acknowledging that our actions and our choices do have consequences. And with that, I will hand over to Shraddha. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for your insights into biodiversity and nature recovery in the UK. I would like to take you to India now with Shraddha Lama. Shraddha Lama is a researcher with a background in social anthropology and history, focusing on food systems and biodiversity conservation in the Indian Himalayas. She has conducted extensive fieldwork with farmers and shepherds, documenting the changing landscapes and multi-species relationships between people and their natural surroundings. The broader focus of her research examines tribes and the colonial legacies shaping environmental planning policy in South Asia. She is currently a visiting researcher at the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery at the University of Oxford. Welcome, Shraddha. Next slide.
Yeah, hello. Hi, Ambika. Can you hear me?
Hi, Shraddha. Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, all right. Okay. So the aim of today's seminar is to explore holistic and collective strategies to navigate the challenges that have come about through the pressures on landscape, habitat, and species. I would like to begin by sharing a small instance. So in 2023, I had just returned from a month-long fieldwork with shepherds in the Kanchenjunga National Park in a small state of Sikkim located in the northeastern borderlands of India. Upon my return, I presented some of my fieldwork findings at the Cambridge Zero Summer Symposium to a diverse audience of academics, policymakers, and scientists working on climate change. During the Q&A session, I was asked a question. What do the shepherds think about the sustainable lives they live in the forest? The question shocked me, and I didn't know what to say because during my month-long stay, I had never used the word sustainability or thought of the forest and the lifestyles of the shepherds as a sustainable way of living. And let me tell you that shepherds in the Himalayas don't think in terms of sustainability either. As a social anthropology student, we are trained to see the world through the lens of the people we study. This curiosity and the skill to observe a community is central to what we do. In the past 5 years, I've had the opportunity to observe not just shepherds in the Himalayas, but also policymakers, scientists, heads of reputed climate change institutions. And what I've found across these broad spectrum of stakeholders is good intentions and hard work on all fronts to protect, restore, and recover nature. But what I've also found is that oftentimes what happens is that these good intentions do not produce the desired result. While talking about holistic and collective strategies, I want to focus on two issues today. First is local governance structures, and second is the importance of history and culture in determining the long-term impact of positive nature-led solutions. So let me give you a holistic perspective of what is happening in the Indian Himalayas. And I hope that towards the end of the session, we can discuss similar case studies in the global north, as I believe that these structural issues are not unique to the Indian Himalayas alone. My case study is a tiny Himalayan state called Sikkim, which is located in the northeastern borderlands of India. So Sikkim is the yellow dot, small yellow dot that you see on the left map. So I want to first begin by locating Sikkim in the map of South Asia. So on the left, that is a map of India and its neighbors. But I want you to focus more on the east. So the map on the right side, that's a closer look on Northeast India. So the Northeast India contains 8 union states, which have cultures and histories completely different from the rest of India. It shares international borders with Bangladesh, Myanmar, China, Nepal, and Bhutan. These 8 states, they were part of the British Empire, and when the British left the subcontinent, they merged with the Indian Union. In the post-colonial period, this region has been fraught by succession demands for separate countries, and there continues to be ethnic conflict and military presence in the region. This region is largely inhabited by communities who were categorized as tribal by the British colonial government, and they continue to be categorized as tribal in the post-colonial period. But since the colonial period, this region has also been a resource frontier. So this is where Darjeeling tea comes from and Assam tea. And there continues to be coal mining, timber trading, and many states have now begun oil palm plantation. When it comes to policy, Northeast is a policy-specific term, and it is also a relational term, and it is a term that is used in relation to New Delhi. So if you see on the right on the left map, so the red dot is New Delhi, and these 8 states are located in the northeast of New Delhi. There is a Ministry of Northeastern Affairs under the Indian government, and there is no such ministry for any other geographical region in India. And there are Northeast research centers in central universities across mainland India. The reason why I am highlighting this is to showcase how some of these issues are often overlooked when we use acronyms such as Global South while researching on India. Another reason why I'm highlighting this is to showcase how these historical and cultural contexts, which haven't been taken into account during environmental policy making in Sikkim or while collecting data, how these historical, cultural, and social factors influence the implementation of policies and their long-term impact, and how often we tend to reproduce colonial power structures and caste hierarchies, 2 things which I think are very important in a South Asian context. I'm sorry, next slide, please. Yeah, next slide, sorry. Yeah. So Sikkim is rich in flora and fauna. It is also called the land of orchids. And in 2016, it was named the first fully organic state in the world by the FAO. Sikkim is home to the Kanchenjunga National Park, or the KNP, which is one of the 34 global biodiversity hotspots in the world. The KNP was first demarcated in 1977, and then in subsequent phases, shepherds were banned from grazing their sheep in the forest. In 2023, I conducted fieldwork with shepherds in a village called Labdam, located right at the border of KNP. I want to focus on one particular instance during my fieldwork. Sorry, next slide, please. So here is Padam Gurung. He is a 72-year-old shepherd in Labdam. In this instance, Padam Gurung is sitting in his kitchen in his home, narrating to me how a group of government officials had come to Lapdang and how he had taken them into the forest, showed them the different flora and fauna, insects, animals, and medicinal herbs. The report published by this team, which consisted of government officials from New Delhi and local officials, would eventually lead to the ban on grazing in the park, and Padam Gurung and other Gurung men in the village would lose access to forests, giving up their ancestral profession of sheep rearing. In the report, Padam Gurung, who is the main source of information, the knowledge bearer, and the person without whom the fieldwork would not be possible, is named as the field guide. Next slide, please. So in this next picture, so here's Padam Gurung again. He is holding another book, which is titled Butterflies of Sikkim, which was again published with his assistance. The book has no mention of his name. The issue here is not just the unequal share of credit, but also the colonial power relations that are recreated. The fact that a group of civil servants from New Delhi, the civil service itself, an institution set up during British rule and still retains much of its power structure. The fact that a group of civil servants from New Delhi come all the way to Sikkim, a frontier region, and draft policies which drastically impact the region showcases the historical continuity in environmental policymaking. These officials bring with them completely different sensibilities and social maps of meaning to interpret the landscape, the land, and the forest from that of the local people. While through this lens, we can see what the problem is. In the past 5 years, I've tried to understand the issue from the perspective of researchers, policymakers, and stakeholders. If we are to see this from the perspective of the government officials from New Delhi, it makes sense as well, because what may have happened is that a group of government officials in New Delhi, they gathered some of their best researchers, hired a local guide, conducted fieldwork, and produced a report which they believed was best for conserving biodiversity in the region. In the final report, they proposed the opening of trekking routes. They proposed the ban on grazing and opening of trekking routes. And they believed that in opening trekking routes, it would generate income avenues, open income avenues for the shepherds who could be hired as field guides. But almost 15 years later, many of these income avenues haven't emerged, and very few shepherds continue sheep grazing. It is fair to say that researchers, policymakers, and those in the upper crust of drafting climate policy would benefit from some qualitative insights into culture, history, including their own positionality in the field while collecting data and drafting policies. I want to go back to the first instance mentioned earlier. I'm sorry, next slide, please. Yeah. I want to go back to the first instance I mentioned earlier about the question on sustainability. It is fair to say that climate change discussions have a language of its own, be it sustainability, adaptation, resilience, etc. Researchers, policymakers across the world, irrespective of language barriers, understand these terms, and we use it to communicate with each other. But for a large section of the general public, including shepherds and farmers, these terms and acronyms carry absolutely no meaning. In the case of Sikkim, one may argue that there is a language barrier as the shepherds do not speak English, but I still think that the issue is much more deeper than this. And just as climate change lingo unites researchers, policymakers across the globe, similarly, I believe that there is a shared experience between shepherds in Sikkim and shepherds in England. And if there were ever an instance where they were to meet and chat, they would have much to share and discuss with each other than with policymakers in their respective countries. And the last thing I want to share is that when we talk about nature recovery, we also need to realize that nature recovery is not just an instance of planting trees or introducing new species or introducing new methods of farming or preservation, but recovery also needs to include our relationship with other species, especially human beings. I'm not in a position to talk about other species, but in the case of humans, we can begin by acknowledging local structures, histories of land, and seeing ourselves as part of these larger legacies. Sorry, next slide. I want to end with these two photographs and a direct quotation from a shepherd. So on the left, that is a village which is called Naya Basti or New Village. That's the literal translation, New Village. The residents of this village were relocated to this area, and this village now forms an extension of Labdang. They were relocated to this area almost 10 years ago after their original village was swept away by landslides. The residents of this village are still struggling to gain legal rights to the land they currently inhabit, and they often talk about how beautiful the original village was. Thinking about Naya Basti, located at the border of the Kanchenjunga National Park, makes me go back and think about the report that led to the demarcation of KNP and how it is so easy for policymakers and government officials in India to overlook local people residing in these areas. On the right, that is N.B. Gurung. He is a shepherd in Labdang. So this picture was taken nearing the end of my fieldwork, and I was trying to draw the connection between sheep rearing and Gurung culture, but also questioning the traditional anthropological divisions between nature and culture. On this day, N.B. Gurung stood in his farm next to his sheep. I asked him, what will happen to the Gurung community if the next generation give up sheep rearing? N.B. Gurung took a long pause, stared at the green lush hills, his ancestral land, and replied, Masira janta, yo hamro purkhaharule gareko ho, hamro sanskriti ho. Our culture will die out. This is what our ancestors have taught us, and this is what we are. We will not survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Shraddha. That was fantastic. Thanks for sharing your research. As someone who grew up in the northeast of India myself, I found this really intriguing and very interesting. Coming back to the UK, I want to now introduce you to Dr. Fiona Plenrith. Dr. Fiona Plenrith is a landscape ecologist at Forest Research. Her work explores species dispersal and climate change in relation to woodland cover, with current projects focusing on woodland creation, temperate rainforest, and pests movement in forestry systems. She uses landscape genetics, spatial modeling, and fieldwork to investigate ecological patterns and support evidence-based woodland management and restoration. Welcome, Fiona.
Next slide. Hi everyone. So I'm going to talk today about the biodiversity value of new woodlands. So I'll define what I mean by that. And my focus will be on the connectivity of woodlands in the landscape. So if you could go to the next slide. So as I'm sure most of us are aware, woodlands are associated with a huge amount of biodiversity in the UK. As woodlands age, we see this diverse range of structures appearing. So this diagram, I think, highlights that really nicely. So when we think of an ancient woodland, we think probably of gnarly old trees and deadwood on the ground and kind of nice gats of glades that butterflies can use. And these different habitats that we get in ancient woodlands are associated with a huge amount of biodiversity. Next slide, please. But these habitats take a long, long time to develop. So if we think of an ancient woodland, we think of all these different habitats. And if anyone's recently been in a young planted woodland, you won't necessarily see those habitats. You'll see a sort of more homogeneous structure in the canopy, and you might not get things like that deadwood on the ground and these gnarly old trees with rot holes that support lots of different fungi and invertebrates. And because of that, we can often discount the value of young planted woodlands in our landscape, but they do provide some value for biodiversity. Next slide. And unfortunately in the UK, we've got a long, long history of fragmentation. So the ancient woodlands that we have in our landscape are seen as an irreplaceable feature, but they're now quite fragmented. We've seen an increase in woodland cover in the last 100 years. A lot of this has been through conifer plantations, but we've also seen a push towards planting and creating more broadleaf woodland because of that biodiversity value that we have come to associate with broadleaf native woodlands. So if you just go to the next slide. So unfortunately, because our woodlands are very fragmented, that brings us to this idea of bigger, better, and more joined. So, but to try and kind of improve the value of the small amount of ancient woodlands we have, we've seen this push towards increasing connectivity at a landscape scale. So I've just pulled out a few quotes from different kind of reports that highlight this push for connectivity. So the UK Biodiversity Action Plan talks about this idea of retaining and creating wildlife corridors, and the State of the UK Woodland Trees report from 2021 talks not just about extending existing native woodlands, but actually connecting up patches of current woodland. And the ACCA biodiversity targets more generally talk about having a well-connected system of protected areas. So this all points to this idea of increasing connectivity between our different habitats. And this helps to reduce the isolation that we see for these populations in small ancient woodlands by allowing connectivity or species dispersal. And this benefits biodiversity by increasing the resilience of that population, increasing things like gene flow, and allowing species movement in response to local extinction events. And in response to things like climate change, we might see species shifting their range north. And so this idea of connectivity between our ancient woodlands is really, really important. So if you go to the next slide. So I just wanted to show this landscape to come back to this idea of our new woodlands and the value they might hold in the landscape. So we've got two fragments of ancient woodland in this picture. This is a screenshot from a landscape in the southwest of England, and these are two ancient woodlands. And I think we'd all agree, looking at this picture, that these are two isolated woodlands from each other. Next slide. But we can see in recent years there's been a new woodland planted there, so that now structurally connects those two woodlands. So I think looking at this picture, I certainly would now say that's probably what I would describe that as one woodland. It's definitely been structurally connected. So what we wanted to do is ask if this new woodland that's been planted there is providing a benefit in terms of connectivity. So does this apparent increase in structural connectivity give us any more species movement, and our different species and our different taxa that we have in the UK, they all move in different ways. So we might see small mammals running between those two patches through the woodland. We might see fungi spores blowing in the wind, or we might think of pollen for plants and plant seeds moving through that woodland. So we wanted to try and collect data on lots of different species to ask how different species and different taxa are using new woodlands. So what benefit do these planted woodlands have? Next slide. The constraint we have with studying woodlands often is that woodlands take a long time to develop. So I've used this term new woodland a lot. And what I mean by a new woodland is actually a 20 to 30-year-old woodland. So it's still quite old, but our ancient woodlands are much, much older than that. So we have to kind of resort to what we call natural experiments or space for time studies to try and study the impacts of woodland creation on species movement. So we set up a natural experiment where we looked at the landscape as it is now, and we looked at where woodland creation had been done in the past, so in the last 20 to 30 years, so that we could try and study how that woodland creation might have impacted species biodiversity. So we found sites where we have two ancient woodlands, and in between we have a planted woodland. And then nearby, we looked for a site that had two ancient woodlands and in between a field. And the idea is that we can compare the site that has no woodland and assume that that's what our planted site looked like before. So we can take lessons, that we can look at the changes between those two sites and understand how that planted woodland is influencing the biodiversity. So we've got 10 sites that look like this across the UK. Next slide, please. And as I've already mentioned, lots of different species move in different ways. So we collected data across different groups to try and unpick that complexity in different species responding. So we've collected data on ground flora, so that rich ancient woodland flora that we think of, like bluebells and wild garlic and species such like that. ground active invertebrates. We collected data on the fungi movement, and also we looked at some of our mammals. So we looked at pit tagging to look at small mammals, and we did camera trapping on the edges to look at our larger mammals, such as the deer. I'm not going to present results for all of these species groups. I just wanted to highlight the kind of complexity of trying to understand the effects of new woodlands on lots of different species groups. So next slide. So I just wanted to pull out a few key species groups. So this first slide is talking about the woodland specialist plants. So woodland specialist plants are often seen as very slow movers. They a lot of our woodland specialist plants are dispersed by gravity, so they can't move very far. So we wanted to really unpick whether these woodland specialist plants are being helped to move between the two woodlands and colonizing our planted woodlands. And we found that many of our species are moving in, and we see this kind of the species abundance when we look at the woodland specialists increased in our planted woodland compared to our fields. We also found evidence that hedgerows might support some of these species, which is really nice. But we actually found that this is only occurring for about 10% of our woodland species. So there's still a lot of ancient woodland specialists that are still isolated in these ancient woodlands. Next slide. Similarly, for the woodland specialist ground active invertebrates, we found a similar result. We see more woodland invertebrates in the planted woodland compared to our open habitats. And we see quite a sharp decline into the field. But again, we've only got about 25% of our species supported. Next slide. The other result I wanted to highlight was the fungi. So fungi are a bit more complex. They move with spores. So we use two methods to study our fungi. We wanted to get an idea of how the spores are moving in the wind, so how the actual movement of the fungi, and then we wanted to look at whether they can then establish. So we took air samples where we sampled spores that would be blowing around in the wind using these air samplers that you can see in the picture. And then we also took soil samples in the same areas, and that allowed us to look at both movement and establishment of fungi, so whether the fungi are actually then using and thriving in that habitat. Next slide. And we found the fungi are a pretty mobile group. So we are focused here specifically on ectomycorrhizal fungi, which are a really important group for tree establishment. And we found that they're very mobile and they're blowing around in the wind quite well. And actually, an added complexity is that we sometimes, for some of our species, see a little bit of a reduction in movement when we plant trees. So that was quite an interesting and complex result. But when we look at the soil, we see absolutely no fungi in the field. And we see those ectomycorrhizal fungi starting to establish in that planted woodland. And in some sites, we got up to 100% of the species shared between those two sites. So that planted woodland is clearly having some biodiversity value for those ectomycorrhizal fungi. And we looked across different functional groups and found similar results. But I just didn't have time to go into every group. Next slide. And then if you just click once more. Yeah, so we found, so all that's to say that, yeah, new woodlands can act both as a habitat and a conduit for connectivity for lots of the biodiversity that we associate with our ancient woodlands in the UK. And we do have evidence that they can increase connectivity. But we do see complexities because this is nature, and nature is complex, as Chris talked about. So we did also see that some species didn't benefit from those newly created woodlands. And for those species, we might need to start using that evidence to developing specific management guidance. Maybe some ground flora might need flora translocations. There's a lot of research at the moment going into the translocation of soils for ancient woodland fungi. And we can start to unpick those different species and how individual species might need help at a landscape level. Next slide. So I just wanted to kind of end by talking about what this evidence means that we've collected for quite particular species on a larger scale. So it really highlights that importance of spatial planning of new woodlands. So, for example, woodland specialists in our study were rarely found greater than 25 meters from the edge of a mature woodland in fields. So we might only get this connectivity benefit if those woodlands are really kind of adjacent to that source habitat, that ancient woodland or that long established woodland. Previous research at forestry research has also shown that woodlands adjacent to ancient and established woodlands develop faster in terms of their structure. They develop more structurally diverse habitats. So that's another kind of piece of evidence that highlights this need for spatial planning. And this diagram here is an analysis we did from our site selection where we looked at different woodland grant schemes, so woodlands that had been previously planted in England. And we found that quite a few of those were isolated from ancient, so they were greater than 100 meters. Some of them expanded woodlands and even less connected to up. So this suggests that we might not get as much benefit in terms of biodiversity from these woodlands as we would have if they could have been placed adjacent to ancient, but obviously that comes with its own complexities as well. Just next to my final slide. So this really underpins that need for spatial planning in terms of habitats and existing woodland. So I just wanted to highlight this piece of research done by colleagues in my research group looking at integrated habitat networks. So this is a map layer that's not published yet, but it will hopefully be published soon, that represents a graduated balance between open and wooded potential. So they looked at not just the wooded connectivity, but the connectivity of open habitats, and have highlighted areas based on the current land use and previous land use for potentially focusing on planting both native and non-native woodlands. So I put a link to the website there, but unfortunately the actual map is still under review. So next slide. And of course, I didn't collect all of this data. We had a huge field team, so just wanted to finish by thanking everyone that spent many hours in the field collecting data from lots of different taxa. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you. That was wonderful, and lots of good work happening at Forest Research, and a lot of resource for everybody and the audience to tap into. So thank you so much. Next up, but before we go on to the next presentation, can I just remind the audience that there is the Q&A function where you can put in your questions, and you could also go in as anonymous if you didn't want to publish your name. So please keep your questions coming. Thank you. Next up, we've got Dr. Saira Ali, who is the president-elect of the Landscape Institute and an award-winning landscape architect recognized for her leadership in place regeneration, climate resilience, and inclusive design. As a team leader of landscape design and conservation at Bradford Council, she has delivered transformative public realm, heritage, and blue-green infrastructure projects that champion community, culture, and sustainability. Her work has influenced policy, secured major investment, and earned multiple prestigious awards, including LI Award for Excellence in Place Regeneration for 2025, Excellence in Health and Wellbeing, and the President's Award in 2023. A dedicated advocate of diversity, mentoring, and social impact, Saira is committed to creating landscapes that improve lives and inspire future generations. Dr. Saira Ali has been caught up, so we have got a recorded presentation, but she will be joining us for the Q&A session later.
built cities for their workers, rows and rows of terrace houses with little on their gardens, but they did build parks for workers to enjoy on their days off. These were the green lungs in the city. But with deindustrialization and lack of investment came decline, poor health, and disconnection from nature. Today, Bradford is a young, diverse, post-industrial city with significant inequalities in health, access to nature, and safe outdoor spaces. Like many cities, we've inherited streets dominated by traffic, fragmented green spaces, and neighbourhoods with limited daily access to nature. Today, our challenges present us with incredible opportunities, a strong heritage, powerful community voice, clear ambition to become greener, healthier, and more climate resilient district. Nature recovery isn't a nice to have for us. It's essential for public health, climate adaptation, and rebuilding civic pride. Our approach in Bradford is a holistic and place-led. We don't see nature as an add-on. We treat it as a core urban infrastructure, as critical as transport, engineering, or housing, providing cooling, drainage, safety, identity, well-being, and biodiversity. Across our projects, we consistently integrate SUDS and blue-green infrastructure, biodiversity, net gain, and habitat creation, active travel, and connected public places, community co-design and youth involvement, and heritage-led regeneration. This integrated thinking ensures that nature recovery isn't a standalone project. It's embedded across the whole city. And everything we do is collaborative. We work with stakeholders, environmental groups, cultural organisations, universities, and most importantly, our communities and our schools. Each partner brings different expertise, health, climate, culture, data, maintenance, and this collective action is what makes nature recovery real and long-lasting. Nature recovery only works when people feel part of it. Collective action is working with people, not for them. Across our projects, we use co-design workshops for children and families, partnership with community groups, universities, health organisations, citizen science through biodiversity monitoring, local training, apprenticeships, and volunteering. This builds social resilience alongside ecological resilience. And critically, it increases public stewardship, reducing long-term maintenance costs while building pride and ownership. Young people are a key driver for change in the district. Across our neighbourhoods, we've delivered projects that act as building blocks for wider master planning, parkways, greenways, and pockets of spaces that test ideas at small scale. Each project becomes a learning tool, helping us co-design, gather data, and build confidence for city-scale interventions. Master planning grows organically, informed by community feedback and a lived experience. Kashmir Park is one of our most meaningful examples of nature play, its climate resilience and community ownership. It began as a derelict, underused field. Working with over 2,000 children, we co-designed a nature-rich play space with hills, planting, natural materials, and places to explore. The project really transformed this neglected space and create this inclusive neighbourhood park. And it also, at the same time, improved local resilience to flooding and overheating. And there was meadows and orchard planting and wildlife zones created. The project also showed how nature play can build confidence and physical activity and a real connection to place. It also demonstrated how small neighbourhood projects can spark wider environmental awareness and that community pride. While our city centre focuses on resilience at scale, our neighbourhood parks show the power of community-led nature recovery. Atta Park is another great example. of doing a lot with very little space. We transformed a neglected corner into a biodiverse community garden with planting, food growing, shade, and a sense of ownership. These micro interventions really matter. They create stepping stones for biodiversity, offer daily contact with nature, and give communities spaces that they feel proud of and responsible for. At a park proves you don't need a big budget or vast land to recover nature. You just need the right partnerships and a shared vision. The Transforming Cities programme is one of the biggest pieces of work that's happened in Bradford, and nature is right at the centre of it. We've replaced tarmac and traffic dominance with tree-lined boulevards, rain gardens, climate-adapted planting, greening through movement corridors, pedestrian-friendly connections, biodiversity routes linking neighbourhoods to our city centre. It's a transport project, but we've turned it into a climate resilience and nature recovery programme by design. The scheme has also brought native wildflower habitats into the city centre, providing feeding opportunities for pollinating and other insects, which in turn will provide feeding opportunities for birds and bats, and offer food for birds of prey like the peregrine falcon we hope will breed in the box erected at City Hall. The ornamental flower beds not only provide visual interest for people, but they also have been selected for their value for wildlife. The city centre now offers an abundance of opportunity for the use and for wildlife that didn't previously exist in Bradford and is a rare across the country. This is nature recovery at city scale, embedded through transport investment, and it shows what can happen when transport, health, heritage, and green infrastructure work together towards one vision. What we've introduced here is over 200 new trees and extensive biodiversity-rich planting, suds that will slow, store, and clean rainwater. We've prioritised walking, cycling, and public transport, and created shaded routes that will help the city adapt to our summers, and habitat integrated into the built form. This has created a cooler, greener city centre that really encourages people to spend time, connect with others, and really feel safe. 3 principles have been key in this. What we've learned across all our networks is that 1, start with the community. Nature recovery succeeds when people feel ownership and see themselves in the space. Co-design builds resilience. The community is the most important long-term maintenance partner. Invest in people as much as the place, and especially children. 2, design for multiple outcomes. Nature recovery must be cross-disciplinary. Transport, heritage, planning, health, community, they all must work together. Every intervention must deliver climate resilience. Health, biodiversity, placemaking, not one at the expense of another. And 3, think in networks, not sites. Nature recovery is about linking neighbourhoods, parks, streets, and squares into continuous ecosystem. Small interventions matter. Pocket parks and microhabitats add up. Across the city, we are seeing measurable improvements. We've got more green cover, more trees, better stormwater management, cooler microclimates, increase in pollinator and urban wildlife, higher footfall in regenerated areas, improved perception of safety and well-being, children experiencing nature in everyday spaces, and the communities are more engaged in climate action. These aren't isolated wins. They form a connected ecosystem of climate resilience. When done well, it doesn't need programming. People animate these spaces naturally. Bradford streets now work at all times of the day for living, working, play, and culture. And you know a plan is working when you stop noticing the design because people have made it their own. When a space works, you don't need events to activate them. People bring the activation and they inhabit it. Prioritizing entryways and gateways in the urban realm has also been a focus for us, setting the scene and drawing you into our cityscape. Talking Town is a historic area that has suffered long-term decline. Through our Townscape Heritage Scheme, we didn't just restore heritage buildings, we reimagined the streets and invested in public spaces. But crucially, we used the opportunity to bring nature back into the oldest part of the city. And the impact was pollinator-friendly planting in dense urban core, green streets that cool the microclimate and manage stormwater, more accessible, attractive streets that increase footfall, a reconnected people with their heritage and sense of place. New habitats introduced in spaces previously entirely hard surfaced. This created a greener, safer, more welcoming environment that supports biodiversity and economic vitality. Nature recovery is supporting the revival of a heritage high street. And active travel isn't about fancy cycle lanes. It prioritizes building a healthy community. It's about enabling everyday movement, going to school, to the shops, to meet friends. If a parent doesn't feel safe letting their child walk or cycle, we failed, and we've built nature into all of that. Bradford is proving that even in a dense, diverse, post-industrial city, nature recovery is not only possible, it can be the driving force of regeneration. By thinking holistically and acting collectively, we're building a city that's greener, healthier, more climate resilient, and more joyful for future generations. And by blending heritage, placemaking, biodiversity, and community action, we're creating a city that is greener, healthier, more connected, and ready for climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope Sarah is able to join us now, but what a fantastic presentation of the work that she has done in her city. I would like to thank all of our speakers this afternoon, and I would also like to invite the audience again to, before we begin the Q&A session, to enter their questions in the Q&A chat box. Handing it over to Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambika. Could we just go to the next slide, please? Great. So thank you for all your questions. And if the speakers want to come back on, that would be great. So I'm going to start off with a question. It's from Sue James, and it's Sue's asking Chris, it's actually relevant to all of our speakers, I think, about the timeline for nature recovery. That time, like critical timeline, and what that means, and also, can we actually recover species, or is it really about that principle of halting further loss and protecting better what's remaining? Chris, can I hand that over to you?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Sue, for your question. I think in short, the answer's that we have to halt further loss. We have to better protect our remaining habitats, and we also have to recover as much as we can wherever is possible. Nature recovery gets kind of thrown around as a term, and it's kind of then ignorant of all of the complexities and trade-offs associated with that. And then when we begin to think about the trade-offs between varying land uses, you then know quickly that things can become quite massively politicized quite quickly about giving over, say, agricultural land, however productive, for nature recovery and all that other stuff. I think, in short, we can recover nature and species. Let's not underestimate the resilience of our species, both plant species and animals, non-human beings as well. Um, that's not to say we can rely on their resilience. We're certainly testing it. We're doing our best to test it right to its very limits, I'd say. And now, really, we need to give it a helping hand. To do so, we need to be strategic. We need to be measured. We need to consult, and we need to engage. But we certainly need to upscale recovery. And as I kind of touched on in my initial presentation, it's about, my job is very much kind of connecting the dots between accountability, thinking about things that are happening on site, things that are happening off site, things that are happening in far-flung places, and kind of trying to connect the dots to get people to take responsibility a little bit more for the things that are happening as a result of their business. Ultimately, my main clients are developers, and they make money out of developing buildings, building buildings, operating buildings, managing assets, etc. And their business model would cease to exist without their reliance or the reavailability of all of these natural resources, which are having massive implications around the world. So we need to use what we can increasingly to make the case for recovery, to identify opportunities for it, and then work with a diverse range of stakeholders to actually deliver it at scale. But yeah, I mean, we can and we should, and I'm sure that we will. But yeah, we need to do both. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm going to put a question now to Shraddha, which has come up. Could you say a little about people's connection through culture and language with both managed and natural landscapes, particularly forests, based on all the research that you've been doing?
Yeah, the forest is the culture of the Gurung community. If you read any anthropological or any historical text on the Gurungs, you will see mentioned that they have historically been shepherds or pastoralists. So it's believed that that's how they including me because I belong to the community. It's believed that's how we've migrated from what's today northern China downwards to the Annapurna ranges in Nepal. So in a way, the culture, the language is completely intertwined with the forest, and in this case, what is today the Kanchenjunga National Park. And in Labdang, it was very evident because there was also the foraging culture that women practiced, always having had access to the forest, which was suddenly cut off. The lives of the shepherds are completely intertwined with the forest. So the Gurung men in the village, they rear in the forest throughout the year in different locations, whereas the women stay back in the village, take care of children. But the women also they make carpets and clothing, which are again sold in urban markets. So that tradition is still there. Although younger generations, we haven't been taught how to do that because it's very difficult, and because sheep wool is also becoming much more rare and expensive. But yeah, the language culture is completely intertwined with the forest. So in that way, it's very concerning because, like if the next generation don't continue sheep rearing, then what is going to happen to Gurung culture, or what is Gurung culture anymore? So yeah, that is a very concerning aspect. It's also very interesting because research on the Gurungs have mostly been confined to Nepal, to Western Nepal, or the hills below the Annapurna ranges. And if you read anthropological text on those areas, most anthropologists write that, most of them have been recruited in the Gorkha army. And so a lot of them have given up sheep rearing. So this culture in a way is only is still intact in Sikkim, but I wish I could be more positive about it, but yeah, that's what's happening in the region. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have questions as well for Fiona in the chat. So a question from Richard about your findings and just the sense that the valuable guidance that will be coming out of your research. Could you talk a little bit about forest research guidance and how you're going to share your findings, and also how people can access those?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Richard. So the project I specifically presented on was a DEFRA funded project. So we have written it up in a kind of evidence report to DEFRA, which is currently under review, and it will be publicly available on DEFRA's website. So all DEFRA funded projects get published on their website. I don't know their timelines, unfortunately, because that's with them. And there are kind of a suite of tools on the Forest Research website as well that tell you about current research and ongoing. But yeah, I wish I could give a nice answer on exactly when it would be published, but I don't know.
Thanks. And then another question. We can open this to any of your speakers, of the speakers. What role, if any, can rewilding play in nature positive and also in net zero, in fact, and particularly in involving voluntary organisations and just that momentum that community impacts, the community impacting climate action? Do you want to answer on that, Fiona? I think you covered a
Yeah,
little
I'm
bit
happy to
of it,
start, and
didn't
then if
you?
others want to say something too.
Yes.
Yeah, so the rewilding movement, so I think all of our talks have touched on this importance of landscape scale being the key. You can't just, I'm a forest ecologist, I can't just look at the forest, I need to think about the whole landscape because the neighbouring habitats influence that. And that rewilding movement has been really nice to see in the last few years because we see these much larger landscape scale restoration targets that don't just think about the forest, but they think about the open habitats in that whole area. So yeah, absolutely. I think the rewilding movement definitely has a strong place in nature recovery in the UK. But I would say that I think it's very important. Maybe I'm thinking this as a scientist, but we need to have a goal when we think about restoration. So when we're doing rewilding, what is the goal there? What species do we expect to come back? What would we expect to see from our landscape? But yeah, I'm happy if anyone else would like to say anything else.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in and then offer it out to anybody else. I really resonate with the your point, Fiona, about having a goal, having something in mind. People think about rewilding or regeneration or renaturalization, whatever it may be, as kind of, oh, we'll just leave nature to it and it'll be all right. And actually, kind of, to put it bluntly, we've screwed things up so much that just won't happen now. And if we want to get to, regenerative landscapes or getting back to landscapes as they once were, they actually take quite a bit of consideration in design and management, and they are quite hands-on. So having a goal in terms of exactly what you want the habitats to be, how you want the landscape to function, what benefits and services you want it to deliver, all of those things should be front and center when we're thinking about any kind of project, really, at any sort of scale. In terms of meeting global nature positive ambitions, absolutely, it's central. Whether we call it rewilding or any of the other kind of terms that I've thrown at it, we're talking about nature recovery here. We're talking about enhancing biodiversity. We're talking about supporting the provision of wider ecosystem services through adopting nature-based approaches or nature-led approaches, really working with nature and not against it, because there are a range of synergies and efficiencies, including cost, that can be delivered as a result of that when done and adopted effectively. In relation to the net zero point, it's actually something that I spoke at Future Build about a year ago now, and it's quite an interesting point because all of that is about scale. So if you think about nature and natural ecosystems in relation to the UK's own nationally determined contributions, and even quite large scale rewilding projects or peatland restoration or afforestation or salt marsh restoration projects won't get us to where we need to be in terms of our nationally determined contribution for getting to net zero, because we have a whole host of very carbon intensive industries and sectors happening more broadly, and our GHG emissions per capita are really quite high in relation to the rest of the world. So that's not as simple. But if then you were to flip it and consider a country like Brazil, then actually, because of what they've got and because of where their nation's set up, it becomes much more feasible domestically. Globally, obviously, nature is essential for supporting net zero. And as I said earlier, when we're kind of stress testing our habitats and the resilience of them and our species and our flora and our fauna, we're certainly stress testing the ability of our Earth to continue to provide its sort of sequestration and storage benefits in all of the different sinks that we have and we rely on. In short, it's critical. Yeah, in short, it's critical. The elongated answer is that it's inherently complex, like everything, to kind of put an exact figure on it. But yeah, super, super important to be to support both nature positivity and net zero.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Fiona. So we've also got some questions about design. You've just touched on design. In fact, both of you have in different ways, the objectives and so on. So I guess a question, what role can design play in nature recovery? And we can, I think, link that with a question, an anonymous question in the chat, which how can designers get clients and local authorities on board with nature-based solutions, especially when resources, money, and also timescales are such an issue? And can I bring Sarah in to start with that one, if that's all right? Talking about nature in cities. Sarah, are you there? Yes, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Lucy. And apologies for being late. But yeah, I mean, in Bradford, the work that we do is very much landscape-led and that thinking. And for us, it's about the wider benefits that we can have. And, it's not always about a particular project. It's how those projects and the way that we design them actually impact as many people and as many projects as possible. And every little helps. And, regardless of whether it's a small project or a large one, it really is about kind of looking at the impact that you want to make and the partnerships. And for us in a place like Bradford, and especially as a local authority, it is very much about our partnerships, because we can't do this on our own. And I think, one of the important messages, if anything, is that partnerships bring not only knowledge and expertise, but also funding. And different funders are looking at different outcomes. And it really sort of makes the projects a lot more interesting, but also you're able to, the outputs are greater. And for us, the way that we've been able to do that really is by kind of creating stronger relationships, and sometimes they take time. But when we're pulling briefs together, we sort of make sure that kind of that environmental funding, what we want to do, it is landscape-led. Nature is embedded from day one into the brief, so that the importance of it is there, and it's not something that kind of drifts in or out. And it's locking in the most important things. Bringing nature into our towns and cities is so crucial for all the benefits that I talked about in the presentation. And, the more partners, the more funding that you can bring. And if there's one message, really, it is that partnership working.
Thanks, Sarah. And would any other of the panel members like to talk about that partnership, maybe the co-design aspect, stakeholder engagement aspect from their work?
I just want to add to that. In terms of, as a landscape architect, we have a really strong team in Bradford, and we are involved in projects from the beginning. And one of the things that we've learned is that take the community with you. Especially our young children, work with them. They are the future. It matters. And it's that behavior change. So we're changing the way that not only we design projects, but actually the way that our community is engaged, and finding really interesting ways to sort of, that citizen science. So different projects have a different focus, but actually, how do you involve young people in that kind of co-design, help as design schemes? One, because they get a better understanding, they're learning with us, but also that ownership of projects, stewardship. There's a big issues around maintenance, who's going to look after things, and it comes down to the money. When you've got really strong partnership with communities, that works much better as well in terms of design.
Okay. Thank you very much. moving on to another question from Jonathan. So I guess this is also about connecting up different skills and people. So do members of the panel have any opinions on the lack of commercially available plants or a species range of those plants for extending plant community habitats? And also pointing to the industry's understanding of soils and hydrology and how it is actually more of a connected system than just the plants alone. Fiona, do you want to maybe come in on that from your woodland
Yeah.
establishment?
I can't speak to commercial because I very evidence-based and I don't deal with the commercial side of things.
Yes.
But yeah, from the point of view of things like there's a lot of research and forest research on the kind of impact of the trees and the woodlands on the hydrology. So we have a whole group that does that.
Yeah.
And this idea I spoke about with like floral translocations, there's a lot of research going on at the moment about if you want to start getting your ancient woodland plants into your younger woodlands, there's these ideas coming out about translocating them from nearby ancient woodlands. That's quite a tricky thing to do. You've got risks of spreading diseases. You've got will they even establish in those new woodlands? And then you've got to think about the kind of progeny, like the genetic, where it's come from. So we tend to think of that of doing that on very local scale. So we might do that from a neighbouring woodland into a planted woodland rather than buying that from somewhere else because we don't maybe know the background. So I think it's quite a difficult problem, but a very important one if we want to kind of make the most of our new woodlands. But yeah. Sorry, I can't speak to the commercial question.
No, but the connecting across the soils and species, it often is the perception that it's plants, but it's much more than that. And I think also you brought that out with your timeline, didn't you? Chris, do you want to say something on that as well from your perspective on projects?
I can certainly try. I think I'm gonna broaden it out really, rather than
Yes.
speaking to things that I wouldn't be able to talk to in any detail. I think you're touching on something there, which is that there is a skills gap right across the sector. It's not just about, we have a team of 40 odd ecologists getting good botanists through and into the industry to support things like mandatory biodiversity net gain, for example, or to input on ecological design is increasingly difficult. There are skills gaps right across the sector, and that's something that we need to address, and that's something that needs to be considered much more systemically, getting into things like into the hydrological space, etc. The gaps remain the same. I think critically we need to be upskilling. There needs to be a reconsideration of the value of particular skills much earlier on in curriculums, and really hitting home the necessity for people to be positioning themselves in this space. But yeah, that's about as much as I can add. I think it's indicative of an issue that we're facing as an industry.
The skills and the connecting of skills, though, it's very, very critical, isn't it? Well, I think in terms of questions, unfortunately, we need to draw the discussion to a close. So thank you so much to all of you speakers for sharing your insights to our discussion, and also to the audience for your questions. It's been amazing. Can we have the next slide, please? So you're very welcome to look at our library of resources from Workstream 8 on adaptation and resilience. So this is a resources map about today's some of today's topics, and this will be sent out to you. And then on the next slide, and then we have various other resources about dialogue, CPD sessions, which are all freely available as well. And then the next slide. Thanks. So to close, we'd like to bring this back, I think, to that balance between optimism and reality. So connecting with that global community and also actions, I think can be really helpful to keep our focus on some of those really important key principles. So reversing loss and recovering nature, and also the complexity of that and just the diversity of nature. And also really keeping sight on those key principles is so important to inform innovation and how we work together on that. And so also I think just to end with, most of all, it's worth focusing on the fact that by working together, our collective actions on individual projects, including small projects, do have a cumulative impact and bring tremendous benefits, and this aspect of cumulative impact is really important for adaptation and resilience in particular. So working together, we can create impetus for restoring and reconnecting habitats, landscapes, and people. And so it just leaves me to say thank you. And that's the last slide. And by all means, we invite you to join our group or to access our resources on the links. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.